Thank you to the four of you. I was listening with great interest. And I will be short because I want to give time to the audience. But I guess in my attempt to sort of think together the different presentations, I think that maybe where Leigh, where you ended is almost sort of a place where I feel that all the presentations really emphasized, which is this, first of all, really, my sense is that this panel really did focus primarily on the question of doing, of what photographs do, and that there is a kind of a ambivalence in all of the presentation, in the ambivalence that is open, not sort of disguised, but really that there is a sense that on the one hand there is a promise associated with photography. Maybe in the case, Sophie, of your talk, maybe that promise to me felt like it was the most highlighted because we really sort of are saving Bobby, right? Or it's sort of the afterlife of Bobby. I think in the other cases the promise has more to do with either with self-empowering, as comes out very clearly in Leigh, or as in Leigh's case, or more perhaps with the ability to capture something that otherwise would actually escape an aspect of history, as in Shawn Michel's presentation about, the ending was the idea that while these are images or photographs of occupation, what we really also see here, if we perform the reading, is a kind of presentation of the condition of African American in history as a history of an escaped artist, and also Elspeth, if I understood correctly, also the kind of by tying the history of capitalism, racism, but also of a kind of I guess more of a what is usually presented as an emancipatory narrative of queer, that your reading doesn't kind of allow for any of these simple narratives to operate in itself. So this is my observation. It's not really a question. It's maybe an invitation to comment on this, and then we'll open it up.
All right, I'll jump in. Thank you very much for those comments, because I think what you're saying is certainly something that I've always tried to look at, which is it's not an either or. Photographs do both of these things. They kind of create conditions of possibility for a certain escape, to work with what Shawn is suggesting around the escape artist, but they also can do different kinds of work in the world. So in the context of physique photographs, which certainly did constitute and create a public for a certain group of people who had been marginalized and criminalized up to that point, yes, it helped constitute a certain kind of public, but this is also a racialized public. It's always a racialized public. It's not like somehow we're, at certain instances, somehow we can step away from racial formation in our daily lives, right? So for me, the challenge in looking at those materials was simply, I was just struck in terms of the little that's been written about physique photography, how little has been written about the kind of generally unrelenting whiteness of most of the archive, with the exception of some fabulous work by people like Tracy Matthews, who've actually looked at, the numbers of people of color who are represented in the magazines, but really kind of thinking of doing intersectional critique of the work that these images are doing, and also tying it very much to capitalism, and in my own case very much really inspired by the work of African American historians like Tiffany Gill and DeVarian Baldwin and Robert Weems and Peter James Hudson, and all of these fabulous scholars who are really thinking through the market in relationship to Black citizenship. And that work really hasn't happened so much in gay and lesbian history as much. So it was sort of the thing that I was trying to think. Both things, I think, are true simultaneously.
I think I can echo that comment about both being true simultaneously as well, where the photographs of Bobby and many of the others in the Cast of Susanna collection are certainly aspirational images at the same time, and I'm really struck, in fact, in Bobby's accounts of the sort of vulnerability or fragility of this, new identity or sort of perceived truer identity, more authentic identity, but of course the spaces that Susanna and Virginia Prince created were also quite compulsively heteronormative spaces. You know, it was in order to kind of at least, well, they're also trying to escape censure in many cases, but to kind of keep those spaces open in some way. They felt that they couldn't even tangle with anything that might be same-sex desire in any sense. So I should say that that's kind of the other side of those pictures in one way.
I guess I was thinking about sort of some of the conversations about duration and the ways sort of, how sort of photographs, the event of photography and the sort of after and the sort of ongoingness. But I also think that there's something about multiplicity and volume that also speaks to the way that people keep making photographs, right? There's so many, so we select, we have, sort of certain images that, like the images that find their way into the physique magazines or into Transvestia, right? That sort of that get selected, right? But we know that, that contact sheets have multiple sort of even like failed versions, right? Failed versions, imperfect. And I think there's, in our phones, right? My phone has probably 16,000 images on it. That's actually not an exaggeration at all. But but something about that, that it's because the either or, it's not an either or because it's this ongoing investment or commitment to keep making, to keep trying, to keep kind of finding that, as Laura said earlier, right, the kind of wrestling and holding, right, of photography. And that's, and I think there's something really kind of profound in that, or really generative in that.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've had lots of great ways of figuring the sort of promise and limitations, the constraints and desires for escape, occupation, occupied, fixity, and I think we can add fugitivity. I was really struck by Lily's capture, captive, captivation, and I think that's, the captive and captivation, I think also really works with fixity and fugitivity and constraint and escape. One of the things that's so compelling to me about the Van der Zee photograph, the escape artist, I started to see that photograph as a kind of theoretical proposition. And part of the way the logic of it works, right, is that like we see the man chained, but the promise is that he can get out of those chains, right? He can escape them. But we also don't see that. And so to me, the image itself is performing this the captivity and the constraint and escape, sort of the promise of photography, as well as the promise of the escape artist, that it doesn't actually then offer.
Right. Thank you. Okay, so I was told that we have a hard stop at 4:05, so I'm going to move to questions.
Thanks. Hi. Yeah, okay, I didn't know if I was first or not, sorry. I'm curious to ask each of you, I think maybe Shawn, it might be slightly less relevant in terms of the pictures that you showed, whether and in what ways you look into the histories of use of the pictures that you discuss, because it strikes me that one of the defining characteristics of the work, the photographs I should say, because work is something I'm carrying from art, that you showed is that they're intended for a particular kind of circulation, right? And it varies from the family album to the physique photographs, and then on again to Casa Susanna, especially that extraordinary picture of everybody photographing someone being photographed that you showed us. So I think reception and distribution in the ways in which people have used these objects as a kind of a pretext or an opportunity for sociality is something I'd be very interested to hear you talk more about, and the ways in which you might research it or the ways in which it enriches our sense of the pictures themselves. And that's for really basically anyone. I don't mind who starts.
You got to start, though.
All right, I'll start. Indeed, I think that's, in my viewpoint, the most interesting question, which is, and it gets to the performativity in the sense of what photographs do. And what they're doing is they're constituting certain kinds of publics, whether those are counter-publics or private publics or what have you, but they're doing some kind of sociality. So, of course, in physique photographs, what they're doing is, like, quite physical, right? They're stroke images, let's just face it. But they're signifying something else, right? So if somebody has a physique photo, they're kind of a code, if you will, right, in the 50s and the 60s in terms of who has them around, et cetera. But they're also training manuals, right? Because it's through the production of a type of body, through looking at the images, that instantiates a kind of modern gaze subjectivity, basically, that can then be recognized by others. So there's a corporeal aspect to the images that kind of do a kind of physical work on the body. I mean, provided you go to the gym as opposed to just look at the physique magazines, of course. So, and that in and of itself, I think, is a social relation, right, in terms of how your body is read, with or without the magazine itself or the photograph itself. Maybe this is another example of the event of photography where you don't actually need the photograph anymore. All you have is your biceps, and that just works just fine, right? Because you at a particular time and place. But it's a really great question.
Sure. I can say certainly where the Casa Susanna photographs, if we want to, or the Casa Susanna photographs such as we have them at the AGO or further kind of beyond those networks, Transvestia really is an extraordinary resource for precisely because of the sort of autobiographical element. There's an looking back, but also this kind of aspirational autobiography going on, not only in the photographs, but also in the texts themselves and the back and forth. And Virginia often is inserting her editorial voice, sometimes with just something as simple as like a man in agreement with someone's point, or longer sort of pleas for other stories or activism. So I think that's certainly that's one key source for tracing the network. But I think a lot, so beyond that, I think a lot about the exhibition space, the social space, and the sort of subjects that we encounter in all kinds of photographs, and what creating, what the stories that exhibitions can tell, and how you create that space, and how sort of careful you are. So, for instance, with that Outsiders exhibition, we worked with an outside advisory committee, of which actually Elspeth was a very key member, talking about precisely how do we responsibly put this material on view? How do we make sure that it's seen in its full context? So I think working with people outside the institution is really important for that. The people were local, but brought various expertise to it. And I think including, the inclusion of people might feel different ways about, people who saw the show in Toronto, different ways about the inclusion of those photographs in an exhibition that included mostly well-known makers, including Gordon Parks and Gary Winogrand and Danny Lyon and Nan Golden, along with Arbus and a group of filmmakers like Kenneth Anger and Shirley Clark and Marie Menkes. So that's a kind of an attempt to make it art, capital A art, and in fact, I certainly see it as the opposite, that in fact that it trying to, it's not even the opposite, that it is, that that those works take up there as much space as any of the other works that were in the show, and they, the central kind of idea of the exhibition was practitioners at that moment trying to make what for them was a more authentic picture. And so we saw different kind of ways of that functioning. So I think that social space of the gallery, I think of it a lot, that social space of the gallery as being one that we can use more, deliberately, proactively to think about who we're making room for and how.
Did any of you want to respond to this? If not, I'll move to.
I would just have a brief response, and it's kind of a sideways response. I was struck that this was not the Shadow Archive panel, and yet at least two of us explicitly were talking about the Shadow Archive, and I felt that the Shadow Archive was very present in all of the presentations. And so I think that, to my mind, that is a way to think about the ways that photographs come to have meaning only in relation to other photographs. And so that is one of the ways that I would think about circulation, like what's circulating around these images, what other images give them meaning, like animate their resistances.
Other questions? Yeah, please. I think they're bringing you the.
Thank you for the fabulous panel, from which I learned so much. And I have a specific question for Leigh, because I almost did that album. And you saw that when I went forward one, and the cover was, and so that album continues into the hospital wards, I think. And so I just wondered whether you had thought of what's going on there.
Yeah, I did actually have a sort of one image at the very end that referenced that. So, right, like Laura said, because he was in the medical battalion, it's the Christmas show that takes place within the hospital ward. And it's pretty much, I think, the sort of framing is similar, but it's an enclosed space, and it seems like mostly white women performers. And there's something, I think, that speaks, well, a couple of things. One, that, I think this album in particular is really, at least the first part is Leigh really trying to narrate a particular moment, and he's very methodic in the movement, right, in the chronology, and almost, it's not like these are afterthoughts, but it actually, for me, underscores the segregation, the kind of the racial gender segregation of who has access to which kind of women's bodies. That's, I guess, sort of where this is, but these are really just preliminary thoughts about this album, yeah.
I too want to thank everyone for an incredible panel. I'm going to cheat and ask two questions, and you can decide who's going to answer it. First, Sophie, you began by talking about how originally, or the collection, there was very little context provided, no names. And so part of me was thinking that given the particular photos in the set that's there, that perhaps this anonymity is actually can be a form of protection, and that they were circulated, to get back to the question of circulation, within a subculture for whom recognition is important, but for whom disidentification was also a crucial part of it. So to connect to previous panels on kind of the ethics of engaging with the social life of photographs, a caution perhaps about kind of the understanding when the imperative to name is enacting our responsibility to the people and the survivors in the photographs, and when perhaps we need to stop short of it, and just maybe some conversation about how the art gallery handled it. And the second question is for Leigh. I was so excited when you worked on the album because Black radicals and not so radical figures who tried to kind of have this, who enacted a kind of internationalist vision during this period of whatever, tumultuous period of the 1960s and 1970s. And I've been thinking a lot about this book called Radicals on the Road and Radical Tourism. And so in connection to the work of Scott Lederman, who talks about Vietnam as kind of a tour of duty, so tourism, like war as tourism. And so that's the framework in which my question is, how does your project grapple with Afro-Asian connections and disconnections through the album?
I can answer quickly, just to give Leigh time to ask her question. So we took our lead from another article that Ms. Bob Davis wrote in the Transgender Quarterly Studies, which talked a lot about, like, please use the fem names. Fem names are safe, essentially. I am reducing her argument and the evidence she marshals for that greatly, but she had done herself a huge amount of research around using the Casa Susanna book, which includes no names because the collectors in question who published the book didn't know. It really took the publication of the book to kind of stimulate the history, and Ms. Bob, who teaches music but maintains this Louise Lawrence Transgender Archive, is very much interested in preserving evidence and stories of transgender life. So I think it's through the tracing of fem names that becomes possible. So I'll leave it there. I'm happy to answer further questions after that.
Thank you. So to be really quick, because I know Maria wants to ask a question, but in the context of the cleavers, it's at once there's a tension with the Panthers who are both trying to reach out. The cleavers who are needing to within the geopolitical landscape of trying to actually secure liberation struggle status, they need actually to identify to have the Vietnamese and North Korean governments recognize them. So there is a very real material adoption of the Korean concept of juche, of self-reliance, right? Of like kind of thinking through this as a way to position themselves so that they actually can gain the material benefits of being recognized by the Algerian government. But then that tension shows up in a different way for the Panthers, and I think this relates to the La Vallée album, is that the Panthers are both trying, at one hand, through the international section, to reach out and make these connections to the revolutionary Vietnamese government, while at the same time trying to enlist Black soldiers at home as part of Black liberation and Black Panther movement. And those two moves didn't always fit together, but I think this is also one of the myriad tensions that led to the split in the party.
This is going to be our last question.
So just quickly, thank you so much. I was really moved by this panel, and I'm trying to figure out what really moved me. And I thought that I might suggest that beginning with the personal story that Gil Hochberg offered us and the photos, her family photos, and the 5-year-old Gil performing and trying to hold back and trying to not expose herself but yet be exposed, really brings us to all the presentations, from the beefcake images to the escape artists to the cleavers to Bobby, the vulnerability of that encounter with the photographer that the subject and the photographer always share with, but also that moves through spectatorship as well, in which everybody's exposed, the photographer, the spectator, and the subject. And I'm wondering whether it isn't that vulnerability that kind of connects these very, very different kinds of images. I'm just trying to find other terms for vernacular, but there's something in that vulnerability that I think we experienced this afternoon that maybe we could try to discuss further, and I was hoping you might be able to respond.
Well, the models were very vulnerable, who worked with Bob Miser in particular, because he had a particular interest in kind of like street trade, basically. So a lot of these models were, you know, completely down and out. Like they hadn't eaten, like he would feed them hot dogs and give them $20, you know. But there's a kind of rhetoric of how he's really kind of taking care of these people, et cetera, whatever. It's a complicated scenario where these people are, you know, basically many of them homeless. One of the reasons why he gave up his modeling agency, because most of the models didn't have any known address, so they'd get the money and they'd leave, because, you know, there's just, you know, the precarity of like, here's the money, now it's time to move on. So he couldn't actually follow through on actually having a modeling agency, because in order to have that function well, you have to be able to book models and they have to actually show up for a job. So if they've taken the $20 in the hot dog and taken off, then they're not going to be showing up. So there's a level of precarity and vulnerability among the models. And then eventually they start moving in with him to that compound after his mother dies in 1964. So perhaps there's slightly less precarious, who knows. But there's all the ones that are kept on the outside through the buzzers and the watchdogs, right? So there is a real, I think, vulnerability among the models that, you know, you don't necessarily see through the photographs themselves necessarily.
Thank you. I think that we were pressured in time. I'm really sorry, because we could continue. It's a great question, I think. So thank you, everybody. Thank our presenters.